Welcome to the Village Well podcast, brought to you by Village Well Books and Coffee in downtown Culver City. Welcome back to the Village Well podcast. I'm Jennifer Casper, your host, and this morning I'm joined for this introduction by our producer, Josh Stretton Carlson.
How's it going, Jen?
Pretty good. Yesterday was my day off. I needed some rest, and I got some rest, so that's good.
Been a lot going on at the store, for sure.
So much going on at the store. Yeah. One thing I did yesterday was I'm trying to make good on my New Year's resolution to actually read books.
Nice.
I've been, I think like a lot of people, my concentration is just really shot these days with just how busy I am, but also just how much time I spend in the digital world, and it just kills my ability to concentrate. So my New Year's resolution was to read, I think I said to read at least 2 pages a day of something. And sometimes I do it and sometimes I don't. But yesterday I did a good job. I spent like an hour and a half reading in bed before I got out of bed. Yeah, I started reading this book, Gulf, by Mo Ogrodnik. It's a novel about women in the Gulf region, like where the oil states are, where there's like a lot of money and set in modern day, but it follows 4 different women or 5 different women and all their stories, and I guess they're going to intersect. But it's pretty interesting.
It's hard to read even when you work at a bookstore. I just finished Chris Hayes's Siren's Call, and it kind of radicalized me about how all these tech companies are just, like you're saying, shortening our attention spans. So
interesting.
It made me purchase a New York Times paper subscription. So I get the paper delivered every day physically.
Did it start?
Yeah, it's a cool, his argument is basically like the digital version, their monetary incentive is to make you keep clicking on different pages. So they want to enrage you to get you engaged. So
they don't show you the articles you'd see if you just looked at them in the order that they show up on the newspaper pages.
Because with the incentive structure there, they've already made their money by selling you the paper. So they just want to present you with the best possible product so you keep coming back. And so even comparing New York Times online to paper, the paper is so much better. Wow,
that's great. And there's just something about reading on paper. It doesn't jack your brain up. Paper calms you down.
Totally.
This is definitely, I'm getting up on a soapbox very often this year about that. We need to just read more on paper. It's the antidote for the anxiety and the ADD that we're all suffering.
Totally. Well, speaking of a book we think you, dear listeners, should be reading.
Yes.
This week we sat down with Professor Leah Litman. We talked about the state of the Supreme Court, how it got so partisan, the impact of decisions that have been made over the past few decades, and how they've kind of scratched the back of Republican politicians. And in return, politicians have given concessions to the Supreme Court. So I think Leah has a strong gift for breaking down these really complex systems into easily understandable kind of stories and anecdotes. She uses a lot of pop culture references. She's a professor, but she's not afraid to swear. So a bit of a content warning. There might be some strong language coming. So we appreciated just kind of a more normal conversation about some pretty complicated issues.
Yeah.
She thinks about these things a lot and was able to give us some steps for how to fix things. So
that's good.
The book is Lawless, available everywhere.
Amazing. All right. Well, enjoy the episode.
Welcome back to the Village Well podcast. My name is Josh Stretton Carlson.
And I'm Sam Tillis.
And today we're very lucky to be joined by Professor Leah Litman from the University of Michigan Law School. Leah is also one of the co-hosts of the wonderful legal podcast Strict Scrutiny, produced by Crooked Media. And today we're here to talk with her about her new book, Lawless. And so, Leah, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So the way we always start our interviews here on the show is we have our guests write what's called a shelf talker. We're a podcast run by an independent bookstore. And if you come into the store, you'll see these little cards hanging around the shop, pitching people on different books. So can you give us just a little elevator pitch? What is Lawless?
So I think the subtitle captures some of it. It's how the Supreme Court runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. And the basic gist is that across a variety of different areas of law, the justices, the Republican appointees, are really fixated on the idea that conservatives and Republicans are the victims of a society that no longer shares their views. And they use that conservative grievance to shape the law. Like, that's the vibe of the decisions.
So I wanted to just kind of launch into kind of the inspiration for writing this book, and also kind of a two-parter, kind of the inspiration for starting the Strict Scrutiny podcast, because I'm sure kind of the motives are probably a little similar or interconnected.
Yeah, so we started the podcast back in 2019. And at that time, I don't think as many people were as focused on the Supreme Court. And so part of what we wanted to do was democratize information about the court and make it more publicly accessible to people. It's a super important institution, but not one that is particularly well understood. And that's also a large part of where the book comes from as well, is the sense that some people think, I have an intuition that maybe these guys are not totally on the up and up, but maybe I don't understand, or their decisions are really long. And when I hear people talk about the court, they use terminology like originalism or textualism, and these sound like concepts that require a good amount of learning to understand. And so the book is an effort to try to get people to trust their instincts and to make what the court is doing more accessible to more people, both in describing how the Supreme Court works as an institution, but also what they are saying in their decisions, to try to point to particular passages in the opinions or what the justices say in oral argument, and how they really are channeling the political movement that they came from, the political party that appointed them. And so it is part of, I think, like a larger commitment to just public education about the Supreme Court, is both where the book and the podcast came from. But, you know, I'm a professor in my full-time job, and I didn't want to make it quite as dry as law school. So it's also, you know, an effort to make it more fun than it might be if you were learning about it just in the classroom.
I'm also a big fan of Strict Scrutiny, and I'm repping Vote Save America today.
Vote Save America.
Something I really appreciate about both the show and the book is that you and your co-hosts, Melissa Murray and Kate Shaw, all three of you are very accomplished in the legal field, but you also just cut through a lot of the BS around the legalese that I think kind of can make these very impactful decisions just seem totally inaccessible. And so I guess if you could kick us off here, I think the public has a general sense that something's wrong with the Supreme Court, that it's almost unfixable at this point. So I guess in as plain English as we can, how did we get to the point where the Supreme Court is so broken?
Yeah, I would say three things. One is several of our institutions at the federal level just became increasingly insulated from the people. So you think about, for example, the presidency, in part because of population shifts. The way the Electoral College works is you can have someone elected as president even though they don't win the national popular vote. You add to that the Senate, and you can have a majority of senators get something through the Senate even though they don't represent a majority of the American people. And of course, those two institutions, the presidency and the Senate, pick who's on the Supreme Court, which already was pretty insulated from the public because the justices aren't elected and they're not subject to easy ways of removing them, such as re-election. So one was just aspects of the constitutional system that always made the Supreme Court a little susceptible to minority rule. And then the second, I think, contributing story is a Republican Party that became increasingly committed to minority rule as well. That is, at some point, the party just kind of stopped trying to appeal or wanting to appeal to a majority of the American public. And they realized they can win elections without having to do so. And so they started catering to fringe elements and an increasingly minority segment of the population. And then the third, leg on this stool is you had that party look around and say, hey, there's this institution that we can capture and basically burrow into and control for life. And that would be the Supreme Court. And so they saw the court as the opportunity to implement portions of their agenda that they didn't think they could get through Congress and the White House. And they viewed the court as a way to provide them with additional opportunities to kind of like replicate minority rule in other places. And so I think those three dynamics / features of our constitutional system all gave us the court that we have today.
So I'm just curious because, when the Constitution was being drafted, the bipartisan system was not a consideration of the drafters of the Constitution. So I'm curious, because the judicial branch, it's a life term being on the Supreme Court, that paired with this kind of bipartisan shift or complexion of the country. Do you think that life term is problematic in any way now, or that it should be changed?
Oh, yeah. There are so many things that the people who drafted and ratified the Constitution just could not believe and were not contemplating, at the time they were doing so. You mentioned life tenure for judges. Life expectancies looked a lot different in the late 1700s than they do today. So I'm not sure that they were envisioning appointing people who would serve for 40 some years. To them, that would probably look like a king, which they didn't want. And so I think, for many reasons, the life tenure system is not probably functioning the way it was expected to. And another one of those reasons is, as you're suggesting, partisan polarization, the idea that there would be these two political parties. And so it would be so easy to pick someone to be on the Supreme Court whose legal views would reliably reflect the political views of the party that appointed them. And at that point, the Supreme Court is just kind of functioning as an additional arm of the political party, at which point you're like, why would we let those guys who aren't elected and aren't subject to re-election be the ones making the decisions, right? If they're just kind of a party hack like everyone else. So yes, those two dynamics, I think, absolutely make life tenure way more problematic than it was, when it was originally created. And I do think that term limits for Supreme Court justices is one of many sensible reforms that would improve the role that the court has in the constitutional system. And I know we were kind of talking about earlier about how people look at the court and they're like, oh my gosh, this is broken. We can't fix it. I agree, right? It's going to be a tough climb and a hard ask. But I also think there are a bunch of options like term limits that are sitting right there that, yes, we will have to do a lot of work to make them possible and implement them, but they would make the constitutional system and the court better.
I want to pick up on something you said there about the veneer of the court as this apolitical institution that has just so clearly washed away in the last, 50 years. Something that you discussed in your book, which I had never heard of, was the Powell Memo. And I actually went ahead and read the full text of it after and was just shocked by it. For those of you who don't know, you can think of it as kind of like the grandfather of Project 2025. It seems like this kind of blueprint for the conservative movement. And again, like, this is kind of nerdy stuff, but I do think this is part of the problem, is that we don't talk about these things in a way people can understand. So could you tell us a little bit about the Powell Memo and how that kind of has contributed to the situation we're in?
Yeah, so the Powell Memo is a memo written by Lewis Powell, who was then at the time a lawyer and affiliated with Philip Morris, the tobacco company. And Philip Morris basically asked him, we don't really like a lot of the regulation of tobacco, so what are we going to do about it? And Lewis Powell put together this memo that outlined different strategies. And the gist of the memo, one of the lines that is just totally unbelievable, is something like, it's no exaggeration to say that the forgotten man in American politics is the CEO, the corporate executive. And it's like, oh, yes, right? If I had to identify, right, the person that our political system just ignores and pays no heed to, it would definitely be the CEO. And then, from there, it kind of proposed different ways of ensuring that this poor downtrodden CEO could get their message out and, have their vision implemented for the country. And it concluded that the most promising method was the federal courts. It called them the growth opportunity. So this is basically, corporate America deciding, how do we want to go about freeing ourselves from regulations that are designed to make the public healthier, safer, better off? And they decided that the federal courts were going to be the way to do that. And so that is part of this movement to take over the courts and get the courts to implement this minority agenda that is the larger kind of theme of the book.
That's something that I feel is reflected when you talk about grievance. kind of the mirroring of a lot of oppressed groups into the oppressor, almost, of saying that we can't have gay rights because the existence of gay people is an affront to religious freedom. You have to be free to be intolerant because of your religious beliefs. So the very existence of this group that you hate is somehow an affront to your personal liberties. You've said similar things with, well, we can't pay women more, that would be unfair to men. We can't expand voting rights for folks of color because what about the white wealthy land owners? Even going back to the Reconstruction era, you've had these arguments. Can you talk about how these biases get legitimized in the way that the court talks about them?
Yeah. So I think in some ways the easiest case study for this is originalism. Originalism, a lot of people have heard of. It's a way of interpreting the Constitution, and it maintains that we should interpret the Constitution based on what the Constitution meant when it was written and approved, back in the 1700s or some of the amendments in the 1800s. And I link this idea to the counter movement to feminism and the backlash to feminism. So there was a backlash to feminism. The Equal Rights Amendment is proposed, which would prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex. And you have a bunch of religious and social conservatives go absolutely nuts because they think this will destroy the family. And then you have a Republican Party that kind of gloms onto this anti-feminist politics and starts to cater to male grievance politics. We obviously saw a lot of this in the 2024 election with lots of comments about, the failure to cater to men, right? And the failure to speak to men, and that, men were feeling left out. And so this kind of political strategy of we need to cater to men and, women's rights, feminism, allowing women to participate equally in society is unfair to men, became part of the political worldview or project underlying the Republican Party. And originalism as a method for interpreting the Constitution kind of does the same thing because it tells courts and decision makers to look back to the 1700s and the 1800s and ask, well, what were the laws and the policies that were in effect at the time? And that's going to tell us what the Constitution means. But that just outsources the Constitution to the people who could vote on the Constitution when it was originally enacted. And that was a bunch of white property owning men. So it's a way of catering to the group that the Republican Party has decided is their constituency and is their base and is aggrieved by the inclusion of another group of people, here women. So it inverts, kind of the traditional way of understanding sex discrimination, to now be about male grievance and to ignore the voices of women kind of as a method for interpreting the law.
Well, I think this ties into just like representation in the Supreme Court and the way that the Supreme Court was developed, kind of going back. This is probably a taboo question for a constitutional lawyer, but if you were to change the Constitution or if you were to kind of like rewrite the formation of the Supreme Court, how would you do it differently? Like you were saying, these people aren't elected, and yet they have one of the most important roles in the checks and balances system. So how would you kind of remodel or reshape kind of the institution?
So first, I don't think it's taboo at all. I think we should be thinking about how to make our constitutional democracy and system of government better. I would start with the institutions that have a role in shaping the Supreme Court. And as a general matter, I would just democratize all of the institutions. I would do away with the Electoral College, right? Make the president selected by a popular vote. I would do away with Senate malapportionment such that, a majority of Congress has to represent a majority of the American people. I would limit the authority of the Supreme Court, and instead of allowing them to decline to enforce federal statutes, I would basically allow them to say, well, we think this federal statute is unconstitutional, but we're going to kind of send it back to Congress. And Congress, if you want it, go for it. And so leave the ultimate decision with the political branches who are directly accountable to the people is probably how I would design the system at the federal level. I would also have term limits for the Supreme Court justices to routinize the process so that you don't get these rapid shifts in American law, just depending on unexpected random deaths, strategic retirements, et cetera, et cetera.
That brings me to this interesting point, which is you talk about over the last 50 years, 14 of 19, I believe, Supreme Court justices have been appointed by conservative presidents.
Yeah.
Of course, you have Mitch McConnell just totally blocking the constitutional requirement to have a new Supreme Court justice under Obama. So it seems like there's been a lot of back and forth of Republican presidents empowering the courts, and then courts kind of in return scratching the back of Republican presidents. Can you walk us through how the Supreme Court has created the conditions for a Trump to emerge? Because he didn't, something I enjoyed learning in your book is like, some of the framing is like, oh, everything was great. And then this weirdo came into the picture and completely dominated and changed public life. And I think you do a good job of documenting like, this has kind of been the plan for decades. So how did those conditions emerge?
Yeah. So I think I would give as the big examples voting rights and the law on campaign finance. So on voting rights, the Supreme Court has been steadily whittling away the protections, both in the Constitution and in federal statutes, for voting rights, right? Mechanisms to ensure that everyone's votes are counted and that everyone is able to vote. So in Bush versus Gore, the Supreme Court somewhat infamously stopped the recount in Florida at a moment when George W. Bush, right, is ahead by a few hundred votes and ordered Florida to certify him as the winner and therefore make him president. And in the process, they risked disenfranchising voters and secured a political win for Republicans that then guaranteed two Republican appointees to the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Roberts and Samuel Alito. Had Vice President Gore won that election, the Supreme Court would have looked very different. And without Bush versus Gore, you don't get Shelby County versus Holder, the decision written by Chief Justice Roberts that dismantles a key part of the Voting Rights Act that had blocked discriminatory changes in voting laws from ever going into effect in certain places in the country that had particularly bad histories of racial discrimination. After the Supreme Court dismantles that preclearance system, states, particularly in the American South, adopt a swath of voting restrictions, engage in redistricting, where they dilute the voting power and political power of racial minorities and basically give Republicans extra seats in Congress and in state legislatures. And then the Supreme Court adds on to that by dismantling a lot of campaign finance regulation that had sought to make political spending more democratic, to ensure that political spending reflected the will of the majority and the will of people. And so that created a system where you could get a few mega-rich billionaires funnel in hundreds of millions of dollars to the cause of electing a president or electing a party that would serve their agenda rather than the American people. And all of these things laid the groundwork for Donald Trump's presidency. And that's not even considering like the specific benefits the Supreme Court handed to Donald Trump, like clearing the way for him to actually appear on the ballot in the 2024 election after several states said, no, you can't run for president and hold an office after you engage in an insurrection with the Stop the Steal movement in January 6th. And the Supreme Court effectively ensured that he wasn't going to face a criminal trial in the election interference charges, charges that he interfered with the 2020 presidential election, before the 2024 election. So they created the groundwork for a minority rule party to win power by not having to win over a majority of the people, by allowing states to disenfranchise people, and allowing the American people to be outspent by a few uber-rich weirdos. And all of that generally paved the way for what we're seeing now.
So I'm curious, as a professor of law at University of Michigan, your two co-hosts are also professors of law. You're involved in academia, you're involved in law, and this, this recent memo that I'm sure you're aware of, this letter that was drafted by the dean of Berkeley Law, who had 78 other law school deans sign it, basically a public condemnation of the Trump administration and the unconstitutionality. But there was something that kind of piqued my interest in that matter was that in terms of like the most prestigious law schools, there was only Georgetown, UCLA, and Cornell that signed it. And a lot of the other most elite kind of law schools, did not partake in or sign the petition. So I'm just curious, because you're involved in academia, you're firsthand experiencing kind of the inner workings of, law school administration. Why do you think that is, that there's still this kind of hesitance or even like capitulation to what's going on?
Yeah, so I think there's probably two explanations, and one of them is concerning. The other kind of reflects a stance or policy that the schools had adopted before Donald Trump. So the concerning explanation is they are trying to keep their heads down, right, and avoid being the next target as Donald Trump kind of goes after institutions of higher learning, and threatens to freeze $1 billion in funds, several hundreds of millions of dollars in funds, or whatever the case is, or to try to revoke their tax-exempt status, under the IRS. That's one explanation, and that would be concerning. A second explanation, though, is over the last few years, universities in general and law schools included in that kind of reflected on when law schools as institutions should make statements and should express beliefs on behalf of the institution. And again, before Donald Trump was reelected, several law schools, many law schools, revised their policies to generally prohibit schools and institutions from making statements on behalf of the schools or institutions, except in like a very narrow set of circumstances in which, like the school's precise offerings, right, or academic affairs were at stake. And so I think that a good number of schools and university leaders and deans thought, I'm actually not allowed to make this statement or sign this statement in light of the policy we just adopted of institutional neutrality. I'm not allowed to like stake out a position on something happening in the United States, right, to schools generally. And so, is that a fair reading of the institutional neutrality policy? I think that is maybe up for debate, at least in some places. But I do think
we'll let the lawyers take a look at that, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I think that is a possible explanation, at least in some places, and that concerns me less.
Just kind of branching out, the theme is just kind of this trickling down of subversion of the legal institution. We're seeing it in the Supreme Court. You're seeing it in state courts. You're seeing it in academia, and even like with the media, the settlements and law firms that were coming after Trump. There's this entire kind of undermining of the legal system as a whole from top to bottom, and it's just concerning,
No, I mean,
least.
It is, kind of like two things I would say about that. One is, I think the administration's attacks on the law and the legal system are just straight out of the playbook of, autocrats, and in particular, recent autocrats who try to like use the law to undermine the law, or, insist they are being respectful of democracy, even as they undermine liberal democracy. And so I think that's very much, what's happening here. You have the administration pointing to the Constitution to say, well, presidents kind of get to do whatever they want, and they have these awesome powers, and federal judges can't tell us shit. And, so they're pointing to law, right, as a reason to ignore law. And that just cannot be, right? The system cannot cannibalize itself. But I think, the Supreme Court has had a major role to play in that. And I think a fair number of people now are kind of still holding out hope and hoping that the Supreme Court is going to save us in some respects, when the reality is the Supreme Court has kind of been playing in all of our faces with respect to the law for a really long time. So we were talking about Shelby County versus Holder, the decision that struck down the big piece of the Voting Rights Act. And the court did that. That is like its reasoning kind of boiled down to a misleading ellipsis, where the Chief Justice wrote this opinion that was like, okay, I'm going to quote this case, insert an ellipsis. And the ellipsis meant he was like making the case stand for the exact opposite of what it said. And so, the Trump administration is not the first to kind of make these insane legal arguments to like implode the law. In some ways, the Supreme Court was doing it first. Although obviously the Trump administration, as the executive branch, is able to do so on a much larger scale.
This is what makes me so angry, is that the Supreme Court has been playing with these forces, like some of the darkest forces in human history, for decades. And then when it blows up in their face, they act surprised. And they issue this 9-0 ruling, and then Stephen Miller just reads it the exact opposite way. And it's like, that's almost a 1-to-1 with an ellipsis trick to like invert the meaning, or, by failing to take January 6th seriously, yep, you enable this judicial January 6th happening in North Carolina right now. And to me, the thing that is just so clear in that is like, what does fascism need as fuel? It needs constant grievance. And so when you give in to constant grievance, you're creating these enemies for people to latch onto, whether it's immigrants, whether it's queer folks, whether it's women. I don't know if there's really an answer here, but like, what can listeners do? What can we do to actually try to effectuate change here when it seems so bleak?
Yeah. So, one thing is the Republican movement kind of built itself as a movement by taking aim at the Supreme Court, right? And convincing a core segment of their voters that the Supreme Court was out to get them, and that they need to focus on reforming and reshaping the Supreme Court. And I think that is something that progressives, people on the left, the Democratic Party, need to learn to replicate. They need to learn to talk to people about what the Supreme Court is doing, why it's important, and why, right, like keeping the court kind of top of mind in many federal elections going forward is super important. I am not obviously going to suggest replicating or even trying to replicate the fascist agenda of like trying to find, right, like a victim and beating up on them. But what I will say is, I think protests and public statements about how fucked up everything is can actually be kind of fun, right? Like if you think about the recent days of action, the signs that say, no one likes you, Elon, or, this Doge stinks, or, whatever the case is. So I think that people need to find ways of engaging in this fight that are sustainable and enjoyable. And again, not suggesting, right, just like punching down, but punching up can be really fun. Like these guys are ridiculous. They are doing grave harm, right, to many people. And so finding kind of like a common punching bag, I think, can be an organizing principle. And you can have some fun in doing that. And, I think that the reality is, if things are going to change, it's going to be because like people demand that they change, right? Like these laws aren't going to enforce themselves. Court orders aren't going to enforce themselves. They kind of need the backing of the public and the people. And I think leaders in some ways like follow the people. Of course, I would love it if Democratic leaders were a little bit more out there as far as engaging in a fight. But I hope they will follow, right, if they see, a majority of the American people, a majority of their base fighting.
So I want to just quickly ask another hypothetical question here, because I love them. But like,
you should go to law school. Law schools are all hypotheticals.
Well, that was part of it. So like, let's say
his dad's a lawyer.
My dad's a lawyer. Yeah, it's arguing is a little bit in my blood, a little bit. But like, if I'm maybe a first year law student at University of Michigan, and I'm hearing all this stuff on the news, and I'm feeling, a little disillusioned about law in general and in pursuing law because of kind of everything that's going down. So what would you say to like a law student, a first year law student, or even something like an activist that's young and that is seeing all this happening and is feeling disillusioned and disenchanted? What kind of words of encouragement would you have or advice?
One is, I think it's right to feel upset and horrified. And in some ways, like, you should reinforce that sentiment and try to act on it, right? Don't run away from it by just ignoring the law or not participating in the law and politics. Related to that is, don't use that as a reason not to go to law school, not to become a lawyer, not to become engaged in politics, right? Don't give this over to the Stephen Millers of the world for free, right? Like, you have to be in the arena fighting as well, because like part of preventing further damage from happening is just friction and resistance. And so like you need to be in the places using the language and the tools, right, that they are using, against them. And the other thing is, things might seem bleak. They definitely do seem bleak, but right, like change happens, change has happened. It takes a longer time period than a single day, a single election cycle. And so one way of thinking about what we are all doing, right, is trying to staunch the bleeding until we are in a position to enact the larger kinds of reforms and make the bigger kinds of legal changes that would prevent us from being in this situation again. I am really hoping, the next time Democrats hold the White House and Congress, they do things that amount to more structural reinforcing of democracy, right? Making elections more democratic, making government more transparent, making it more easy for government to deliver the public services and public benefits that people depend on, making education more accessible. And so, I think there are things that we can do. They are not going to be done tomorrow, given the political makeup of the federal government right now. But that doesn't mean we just kind of like check out and hope things get better because some other people are going to do something.
And for the love of God, let's expand the Supreme Court and get rid of the filibuster. So Leah, how we conclude these interviews is we always ask our guests for 3 books that they recommend. These can be related to your work, our conversation, to Lawless coming out, which again is available wherever you get your books, maybe even at Village Well Books and Coffee in Culver City. So what would 3 books be that you would recommend?
Yeah, so I thought about this, and I think my original 3 picks all would have sounded in a somewhat bleak register. So I'm just going to give 2 of them, and then I'm going to pick a third that is in more of the go fight register that we have also been talking about. So as far as the books that document, some of the deep problems facing our country and our democracy, I think Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money, was really transformational in how I think about a lot of what I see and how I consume news and public messaging. So I would definitely recommend that one. I would also recommend Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt's How Democracies Die. I think in some ways they were too optimistic in looking at the American system and thinking we are not going to descend into the kind of regimes that we see in other countries. They were, in a lot of ways, reticent about making big structural changes like Supreme Court reform. And so while I think they were on to some important things, I think looking back at the timidness in some ways is really important now, given everything that is happening. And then in the go fight register, I think one of my personal favorites is Lady Justice by Dahlia Lithwick. She surveyed several of the women who were fighting back against Donald Trump, particularly in the first Trump administration. And I think telling their stories was really powerful, and documenting the kind of change they were able to make, even in very unfavorable conditions, is an encouraging story.
And Leah, before we let you go, is there anything you want to plug? I know you have a tour coming up.
Yes. So I'm going to be doing a book conversation at the Literati bookstore, the local independent bookstore in Ann Arbor, on May 14th. And then there are 2 events in Washington, D.C. on May 15th and May 16th. May 15th, the University of Michigan Club of D.C. is hosting an event that's open to the public at Holland and Knight Law Firm. And then May 16th, I'll be at Politics and Prose, an independent bookstore in Washington, D.C. After that, it's a little bit up in the air, but at a minimum, I'm going to be at the Hudson Library in Akron, Ohio, or outside of Akron, Ohio, on June 19th. And then our podcast is hitting the road, and we are going to be in Washington, D.C. at Capitol Turnaround on May 31st, and at Sony Hall in New York City on June 12th. And then at the Athenaeum Center in Chicago in October. So we'll also be doing book signing events kind of in conjunction with those podcast tours. And of course, you can catch our regular episodes of Strict Scrutiny anywhere you get your podcasts. New episodes are airing on Mondays.
Fantastic. Well, Leah, I hate to end this interview on such a sour note for you, but I am going to have to say go green. Unfortunately.
Ooh, yucky.
My mom's a Stater. She's from Michigan.
Okay.
But look, we can both hate Ohio State, right? We can bond over that.
The Ohio State University. We can all hate on the. I mean, I personally loved seeing that college football championship trophy break and shatter, not only because it was supposed to go to the Ohio State University, but also
double
because
win.
it slipped and fell out of the hands of JP fans.
Such a perfect metaphor for his handling of the American system, you know?
Yes, exactly.
Well, Professor Leah Litman, thank you so much for joining us today. Lawless is available everywhere, and take care.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you'd like more information from us, check out the show notes or send us an email at podcast@villagewell.com. You can always order the books mentioned through our website. This episode of the Village Well podcast is brought to you by Village Well Books and Coffee. It was produced and edited by Josh Stretton Carlson, and our theme music is from Noah Vickland. See you next week, and keep reading.